All right, so for our group presentation, we did the May 1968 protests in France. We kind of labeled it a turning point in history. This project was done by Thomas, Maya, Ambrose, Sofia, and Collin. So first, we'd like to give a brief overview of the protest. The May protests in France, they lasted from about May 1968 to around June of 1968, so around a month. It involved students and workers in France who felt change was much needed in society. It began with student demonstrations at the University of Paris at Nanterre, but that didn't last as it quickly spread all around France. It resulted in violence between the protesters and the French police, but its legacy impact was not only felt in France, but worldwide also. So for some social context around the time that it occurred, so the France was under the rule of Charles de Gaulle, who was very conservative and authoritative president, and he was often defined by his outdated policies that he had set in place. There was also economic disparity occurring in France. Inflation was growing. Workers were experiencing very low wages for their work, and they were working in harsh working and living conditions. And students and other young individuals believed and challenged the traditional and outdated norms that they were bound by. And they believed with good reason that they were being mistreated by the government. An example of this would be lack of funding for schools as the student population increased.
So for the next slide, we have the causes of protests, but for the students. The May protests did start with the students, since the main complaint was about the education and how poor it was at the time. A lot of students felt that the rules of their education was very much limiting their freedom and their rights to express themselves. They had little to no free speech, little to no student representation, and their curriculum was also outdated, based on like what the times were and everything. There's also, like Ambrose mentioned earlier, heavy overcrowding from student population. As there's like a boom of population from World War II, as those kids grew up, it was starting to overcrowd the schools, and very limited funding was going to fix that. So there was limited room in classrooms as well as limited teachers. Um, and the students were also against the Vietnam War. The students and activists wanted to express their solidarity with Vietnam, so it kind of paralleled the protests that happened in America as well. They were very heavily against France's involvement, and these protests ended up being kind of part of the broader anti-war movement.
And then next we have the causes of the protests for the workers. So at first it was kind of like solidarity with the students. They had a lot of common like enemies and grievances, especially with the government. And so I would say they definitely motivate each other because they um participated in a lot of like rallies and demonstrations together. But specifically, they complained about their labor conditions, like we mentioned, long hours, low wages, and limited job security. And then political dissatisfaction, specifically with President de Gaulle. Um, a lot of people said that the government was functioning more as authoritarian, which is what they didn't like, and that his concerns were for more of the broader population, were not for the broader population, and so they want it to be more equitable and democratic. And then trade right union, they felt their voices were not represented by existing labor organizations. So again, they wanted more like democracy and autonomy within that. So what they did was just general strikes, like I mentioned, with like students and also on their own, work stoppages and barricades to slow the economy. And then for some major events, the student violence began at the Nanterre university, which also spread to different parts of the university, including the amphitheater. And the students vandalized and destroyed that, which was a symbol of defiance against the government. And then the Sorbonne occupation, that was one of France's most prestigious universities, and students barricaded themselves inside, and police used force to remove them. And then this is one of the things that led to a lot of division between law enforcement and protesters. And a lot of people thought that the police used a lot of excessive force, and such as like tear gas, batons, and arrests. But the president also supported this, which like was also really controversial. And then finally, de Gaulle's address, which was televised, and this was May 24th, 1968. And this announced the dissolution of the National Assembly, which is the lower house of the French Parliament. And he called for the French to remain calm and to uphold the Republic's principles. He appealed a lot to patriotism and about like nation's history and values as a source of strength and unity, but this also resulted in mixed opinions. Some saw it as a sign of weakness, and some saw it as a good way to preserve stability.
There were many slogans during the protests, and that helped to raise the idea of restricting the authority and the ruling that the government had over the people at the time. And it really expressed the importance of free speech throughout France. That individuals believed that they should be free to say what they wanted and not have to be punished for it. And youth the youth also started to rebel from and break away from what they believed, how they believed that society was holding them back. There's also The protests also had a big effect on the education of the Parisians, as the economy shut down because so many people within the economy were taking part in the protests that the businesses couldn't continue to run and operate. So there was many strikes and work stoppages. There were also it also caused the creation of unions as employees worked together to try to fight for their own rights. And so afterwards, there was an increased employment opportunities, and also schooling improved for the students, as well as updated curriculum on relevant topics throughout society at that time.
When looking at the result of the protests, there was definitely a very big lasting impact in France. These impacts and this movement led to a lot of significant changes in both a societal aspect and political. So for workers, they received higher wages, better working conditions, and lower retirement age. Students saw shifts within university policies as they wanted to promote greater student representation and participation. There was definitely a big noticeable cultural shift with a big emphasis on freedom, expression, and reflecting the ideas that came through this protest. When talking about the legacy of the protests challenged a lot of ideas and societal norms in society in France. The influence extended far beyond just France, also inspiring other protests and movements worldwide. These protests definitely resonated with younger people, and they contributed significantly to this anti-war movement against wars such as Vietnam War. And even to this day, the protests continue to shape French society and policies, and showed the world that protests and movements do lead to change when done successfully, and was definitely a huge factor in the way that France continues to use their protests to get societal reforming.
And then we've had photos throughout, but we set these aside just to translate the signs and kind of to just show kind of what they were protesting a little bit. So on the left, we have one that is talking about how milk is too expensive for them, but they benefit from third countries which produce expensive margarine. So there was a concern about inflation of basic necessities. So they were protesting that as well, calling out the like hypocrisy of the government. And then on the right side, just like more of a general basic like protest is for better living and working conditions. So we felt just picking these out is important because it really just shows there was so much they were protesting in such a short amount of time, and it was really effective. And then, of course, we just have our work cited, both for our information as well as like various photo credits as well.